As we continue in our answer series, a very interesting question has come for today's lesson. The question is this: what does the Bible teach about a person going to heaven and coming back? A person going to heaven and coming back. Now, here's the full question that came in. That's the title that I took from the full question. The full question was this: what does the Bible teach about a person dying, going to heaven, spending time there, but then being sent back to earth to live until that person dies a second time? The person went on to say in the question, I held the belief that when a person dies, he or she either goes to heaven or to hell, depending on saved or not saved, and that their souls remain there, except for when the believers who are in heaven will later return with Jesus to come to earth, etc. If there is a crossing back and forth between heaven and earth, does that mean that God sometimes sends people back to earth, for instance, to watch over a deceased loved one or give them a message? That seems to contradict the story of Lazarus and the rich man in Luke. I have thought that this is not true from the Luke story of the rich man and Lazarus in Abraham's bosom, that there is no going and coming back, is what this person is talking about. Well, this is a very interesting question, and in fact, it's a question that is very unique even to my church, because a longtime staff member at the church where I belong today has a testimony of going to heaven after a car wreck and then being there so long, I think the testimony is 90 minutes, and then returning to earth, and he is still alive today and a wonderful minister, and that happened back in the 70s. Now, as a disclaimer, I have never spoken with this member of my church. I have never read his books or heard or watched the movie, I believe, that is about his life, or watched any of the videos. And of course, there were multiple of these testimonies that are out there of people who went to heaven and saw Jesus and all the other things and then came back to earth to live on. So I don't know the details of any of those, because I knew that in my ministry at some point in the future that this question that we have today would come up, and I did not want to be biased in any way by those stories and what they had told. And I'm not saying they are wrong. I'm just saying, because of my method of teaching and what I share with people every week and have for all these many years, is I teach what the Bible teaches. I say what the Bible says. I prove the Bible with the Bible. And that's very important to me. So I knew that these, because of all the times that I've been through the Bible, I knew that this question would come up. So I purposefully have stayed way away from those testimonies, not those people, but those testimonies, purposefully, because I knew this question would come up, and so I want to answer this question. So, as an introduction to this lesson, I want to tell you that there was a point in time in the history of this world where things about where you go in eternity after you die made a big change, a huge change. That point occurred when Jesus was resurrected from the grave. And of course, you see, I have a tomb here with the door open, and I've got a cross there, and there is the words before the resurrection and after the resurrection. So let me build this chart for you so that you will understand what happened before the resurrection with people and who died, and what happens after the resurrection with people who died. Okay, so the first point is there's a place called Sheol, and that's the Hebrew word for it. The Greek word in the New Testament is Hades. They're both the same place. Before the resurrection, before Jesus resurrected from the grave, at death, the people who died before the resurrection, at death, the saints, the righteous people, went to a place called peaceful rest. And those who were rebellious against the Lord, they went to a place called torment. So you have this place of peaceful rest. By the way, we learned that from the story of Samuel, that when he died, he went to the place of peaceful rest, Abraham's bosom. And then we've got the other place, torment. And the rest of the story that Jesus tells us about this location is that in between the torment and the place of peaceful rest, there is a great gulf between the two, a chasm, that no one from torment can go to the peaceful rest place, and no one from the peaceful rest place can go to torment, because the way you get into either of those sections of Sheol or Hades is by your decisions here on earth while you are alive. Then at the resurrection of Jesus, Matthew 27, 52 through 53 and Ephesians 4:8 tell us that at the resurrection of Jesus Christ, when he resurrected from the grave, all those who were in the place of peaceful rest, Abraham's bosom, were gathered up with him, and he resurrected them at the same time he was resurrected, and they would go to be saints in heaven. So the saints of peaceful rest left the place in Sheol, Hades, and went to heaven when Jesus was resurrected. So after the resurrection at death, the saints go to heaven now, but get this, the rebellious still go to the place called torment. So peaceful rest is empty. Peaceful rest is empty. But every time someone dies rejecting the Lord as Savior, they still go to the place called torment. And by the way, we read on and we find out that torment is actually growing bigger as more and more who are rebellious go down to torment. Okay, so the dividing line on this is before the resurrection and after the resurrection. Okay, so the question is what does the Bible teach? What does the Bible teach? Now, a resurrection in the Bible occurs when a person dies, goes to their eternal location, and then returns on earth to live again on earth, only to die again later. That's the resurrection that we're talking about. In other words, they don't have a resurrected body. They come back in the same body to live on until they die again. Now that's what we're talking about here. That's the stories that we're hearing about these who go to heaven and then come back. They're in the same bodies. They haven't switched bodies or anything like that. And so this means that we have to look at the Bible and see, okay, how many people in the Bible actually were resurrected in their same bodies, but not spiritual bodies, their same bodies, to live again and live on until they died again. So we're going to first look at those who died and came to life again in the Old Testament. Then we're going to go to the New Testament and see those. And really and truly, as I'm talking about this, you're going to see a pattern. The pattern is who was God using to cause these people to come back to life, and why he was using these people to be a tool to proclaim that a person who had just died could come back to live again in the same body, not spiritual bodies. They're not resurrected. They've just been revived. They're not resurrected. They've been revived and to live on. So in the Old Testament, we've got three. Very interesting. One was the widow's son of Zarephath. Now this is the story of Elijah. Now we're going to talk about Elijah and Elisha. Elisha was the student of Elijah. This story with the widow's son of Zarephath is about Elijah. Elijah was temporarily living in the home of this widow, and the son was there too. So it was the widow and her son. The son stopped breathing, and the widow was immediately concerned and went to Elijah within just minutes or so. And Elijah came to the room and prayed over him 3 times, and the son was revived. He started breathing again. So now, this is interesting. We can't speculate truly whether that son had died or not, because in those days they judged the person's life or death by whether they were breathing or they had a heartbeat. That was for a long time the standard by which we knew if a person was alive or not. Now we know today, with medical experts today, the breathing can stop, the heartbeat can stop, and you can still have brain waves. Your brain still can be working for maybe up to 10 minutes or longer while you have time to get the breathing started and the heartbeat started again to continue the process. So we don't know this about this son of Zarephath. We don't know how long he had stopped breathing. We don't know whether they knew anything or they had checked the heartbeat. But what we know is she was concerned, and Elijah acted promptly and revived this son. Basically, for all practical purposes, he was doing some form of, what we call CPR by breathing into this person or breathing over this person. But it was interesting is because this story is very important. And the reason why this story is very important is because the northern kingdom, whom Elijah was the prophet to, had just really fallen off of the wagon of God's laws and was in total rebellion to the laws. And there was Jezebel and Ahab, and all this mess was going on. And there was a time where a prophet needed to be in place to prove that when Elijah spoke for the Lord, everyone around knew that he was speaking for the Lord, and you didn't dare want to go against the Lord if Elijah spoke for the Lord. And so with that, Elijah comes into place. Now here's the interesting thing about Elijah. Elijah did many miracles, at least 16 miracles Elijah did. They're all in 1 Kings and 2 Kings chapter 1 and 2 also. They're there too. But Elijah did 16 miracles. He called fire down from heaven to destroy the altar where they had the prophets of Baal and had built to cry out to their God, and their God didn't answer. And Elijah called and said, "Fire, come down," and the Lord sent fire. Now here's the thing about all these miracles. All these miracles are happening where Elijah speaks them into being, but it's the Lord who's doing them. He stopped the rain from falling for a long time. He caused the flour and the oil in the vessels to not run out for a family. He caused the rain then to come. And he outran Ahab, who was in a chariot. He outran Ahab, and he brought fire down again upon a captain to stop him. And he stopped the flow of the Jordan River so he could cross over it on dry ground. And Elijah had these special powers used by the Lord. Why? Because there was a need for a renewal of the law of the Lord to try to turn the attention of the northern kingdom back to the laws of the Lord, but they had basically squandered them all and abandoned all those laws at that time. And Elijah wasn't the only one that would do it. So we kind of summarize here. Elijah raised this boy who had stopped breathing, so the reputation of Elijah would get out that when he spoke and when he did something, the Lord, or asked to do something, the Lord answered, and you could trust that when Elijah said, "Thus saith the Lord," it was "Thus saith the Lord." Okay. Now Elijah goes up, if you know, he goes up in a chariot. He's taken away. And he doesn't die. He goes up in a chariot that the Lord has come to get him, and he flies away. And Elisha, his protege, his student, sees all that happen. So here's what happens. Then Elisha has many of the same characteristics, because if you remember, the mantle or the scarf or the thing that Elisha wore around him fell off as he was going up in the chariot, and Elisha picked it up, and that passed on the same abilities to Elisha that Elijah had had. And so Elisha is being notified of a Shunammite's son who has died. In the story, the Shunammite's son is absolutely, definitely dead for quite a while, and here's the reason why. After this child stopped breathing, this child was laid on his bed. The mother got on a horse or a donkey or whatever and traveled to Mount Carmel to speak with Elisha about her dead son. Elisha then traveled back with the mother. So you catch what's going on here? I don't know how many hours have transpired, but this boy is definitely dead. This boy has stopped breathing and is not breathing when Elisha gets to the house and goes into the child's room. The first thing Elisha does is he lays on that body and he warms that body up, because it had grown cold, and that's something that happens in death. The body grows cold. Elisha got up, walked around for a moment, and then he laid on the boy again, and when he did, the boy sneezed 7 times. This is a reviving of a dead child. Elijah had a power to do this, and Elisha had the power to do this. And in fact, when you count the number of things that Elisha did that were miracles, they outnumbered the miracles of Elijah that we are told about in the Bible. Elisha stopped the flow of the Jordan River so he could walk across on dry ground, just like Elijah did. He healed the waters that were poisonous with salt. He filled the valley with waters so that the animals could drink. He caused a Moabite to think that the valley, or the Moabites, when they were coming into battle, to think that the valley was full of blood. He healed the gourds that they ate. He healed those so that they could be eaten. He increased the bread to feed the multitude. He healed Naaman with a command: go and dip yourself in the waters. He floated an axe head that had been borrowed and was lost in the water. So he caused that axe head iron to float. He struck the Syrian army with blindness. Then he restored the sight of the Syrian army. He deceived the Syrians with the sounds of chariots, that there were no chariots there. These are just some examples of the power that was given to Elisha to prove to the people that he was a prophet of the Lord. And when he spoke to the northern kingdom and said, "Thus saith the Lord," you better believe it is "Thus saith the Lord." So to summarize this one, this is the second one here. This child was definitely dead. He wasn't just there in a state where his breathing was suppressed, where they couldn't see it, or his heartbeat was so low that they couldn't feel it. This is a place where this child was cold and dead, and he most definitely had gone to that place of peaceful rest. However, Elisha had been given the power from the Lord to raise this boy back from life. Now that's 2 in the Old Testament. Well, Elisha dies, and it's in the spring. In fact, it is. He dies, and in the spring, after Elisha had died, the Moabites were on their way to march into Israel again, into the northern kingdom, and Elisha's dead body had been placed in a niche in a cave, which was a burial cave. And one of the Moabite warriors died on the road as they were traveling. Now, we don't know anything about his death except for he died. In other words, he stopped breathing, probably didn't have a heartbeat or whatever. And while they were on the move, by the way, in that time, it was customary of all the nations around the Middle East, around Israel also, to bury the person that day before sunset. That was a very important thing in their belief system. Well, the man dies, or at least they think he is dead, and they take him and they throw him in the grave of Elisha. And when the man's body hits the bones of Elisha, which means he hits the ground, the man comes to life and takes a breath. The breath is restored. And this is a confirmation, again, in our story of Elisha about the power of Elisha and the meaning of Elisha. And this story is to prove that what Elisha said, what Elijah said, when they said, "Thus saith the Lord," it is truth. And it was truth, even though Elisha was dead. Now, Elisha didn't come back to life. The deal that this Moabite man died, and they quickly, because they're on the road, they're marching, they're on the road, they throw him into the grave of Elisha. He hits the bones. He comes back to life. Now, that's all we know about this, okay? No doubt the Moabites went on their way, but that's all we know about this story of the Moabite. But it's in our Bible for a reason, to prove that Elisha was the catalyst for miracles, just like Elijah was. So, if you remember, I said this a while ago, medical doctors tell us that as carbon dioxide builds up in the blood, it causes part of the brain to analyze, and the back part of the brain, by the way, where our involuntary brain things happen, causes us, it analyzes the difference between the carbon dioxide and the oxygen in the blood. And when the CO2, the carbon dioxide, gets to a certain point, it causes a chain reaction to cause a breath to be taken. And we breathe because of this constant analysis of oxygen versus carbon dioxide in the blood as it's flowing past that part of our brain. And so that occurs, but what happens is that can stop. But as we know, we can push on the chest and keep it going and make that breathing begin to happen again. That's the Old Testament. That's it. And only 2 prophets from the Old Testament had the authority to revive people from the dead: Elijah and Elisha. Okay, so let's move to the New Testament now. We get over into the New Testament. We do have some reviving of folks who have died in the New Testament. And so here are the 3 times that Jesus raised people from the grave. You remember the daughter of Jairus. They came to Jesus, and then Jairus told him about his daughter, that she had died, Mark chapter 5, verse 41. And Jesus said to him, no, she is alive. And sure enough, the word comes back that she is breathing and she is alive. You remember Jesus came upon a funeral train that was going to the grave with a young man from the town of Nan. And Jesus stepped to the side, stopped speaking to some folks in Luke chapter 7, and he went over to the cart that was carrying the dead son, and he raised that son from the dead. And also, you remember, there was Lazarus in John chapter 11, verse 38 through 44. Now, Lazarus was absolutely dead. We can't doubt that he was not dead. He's in the grave for those days, and behold, he stinketh. And Jesus says this is for a purpose. The purpose of it for Jesus was the same purpose for Elijah and Elisha, so that the people would see the glory of God and the power of God, the power of Jesus as the Savior, to resurrect Lazarus from the dead. Now, I don't need to go into the rest of the stories because we know those stories from the Bible, okay? How long was the little girl, was Jairus' little girl dead? We don't know for sure. Was the boy on the litter dead? Yeah, he was dead. But remember, they buried that afternoon, or immediately in many cases, as they could get the family together. And so, yeah, he was dead. And Jesus revived him too, and Jesus revived Lazarus from the dead also. So, then we come up to that dividing line in the Scripture. That dividing line is where Jesus died, and he went to the bosom of Abraham, spoke across the great chasm, the great gulf, to those who were in torment, and he and he had a conversation with them. But he didn't go to hell. He went to the place of peaceful rest. And when he was resurrected from the grave, this is the Matthew 27:52 through 53 verse, he resurrected all those Old Testament saints who were in the place of peaceful rest. That was Samuel who was in the place of peaceful rest, and Moses and Noah and Ezekiel and Daniel. In fact, the promise to Daniel in chapter 12 was, don't worry about the resurrection we're prophesying now, because you will be raised at the end of this era, or the end of this generation, or the end of this stage. And Daniel was resurrected here. Daniel's been prophesying about what's even in our future, but Daniel was resurrected from the grave at the resurrection of Jesus with all the rest of the Old Testament saints. Nebuchadnezzar was there too, coming up, and they were all seen in the city of Jerusalem. However, when Jesus resurrected them, they did not come back in human bodies. They came in resurrected, glorified bodies to go on to be in heaven. They're in heaven now. They got there with the resurrection of Jesus, but they didn't come back to earth to speak to us. They are there. That's at the time of the resurrection of Jesus. Then, after the resurrection of Jesus, and after Jesus had gone to heaven, he still got some apostles. And if you remember Peter, who was really the lead of the apostles, he was over in Joppa, and news came that Tabitha, or another name was Dorcas, in Acts chapter 9, verses 36 through 42, that she had passed away, and Peter went in and he revived her. You say, where did he get the power to do that? Well, all 12 of the apostles had that power. Do you remember when Jesus called them into the ministry to be his apostles? Now, most people think that happened early in the ministry, but when you do the timeline looking through the Gospels, that did not happen early. It happened almost exactly halfway in the middle of Jesus' 3.5 years. About 18 months into his ministry, when he saw who was all following, had great crowds, more than 5,000 were there, Sermon on the Mount, he calls 12 down, he sets them on this flat spot, and he says to them, Jesus summoned the 12. In fact, in Matthew 10, chapter 1 says, Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over, get this, unclean spirits, to cast them out, and to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. I got news for you. Death is a kind of sickness. It is by sickness that you're led to death. And they had the same power given to them that Jesus had over everything. Those 12 could do miracles just like Jesus. Why? For the purpose of continuing on the message that Jesus was real. Now listen, all that power in those apostles died when the last apostle died. No one else after them had the authority to do it. So Peter raised Tabitha from the dead, just like Elijah, like Elisha, and like Jesus, to prove that the message was true. And when Peter spoke, you better listen, because what Peter spoke for the Lord was truth. And in fact, whenever he raised Tabitha from the grave, Acts chapter 9, verse 42 through 43 tells us this: it became known all over Joppa about her being revived. And many believed in the Lord. And Peter stayed there many days in Joppa with a tanner by the name of Simon. That was Peter, to prove that Peter was an apostle of Jesus. And what the message he was preaching about Jesus was continuing on, and it needed Peter. Well, we come on down later to Acts chapter 20, and a person has died by the name of Eutychus. And now Paul is brought into this. Remember, Paul was the substitute through Judas who died as the 12th apostle. And in this story with Eutychus, Eutychus has died. Now Paul is not in the Holy Land, not in Joppa or that area. Paul is over in Troas. And this young man was sitting in a third-story window listening to Paul preach on. And the preaching was going on and on and on and on. And this young man fell asleep in Paul's preaching. You may fall asleep in mine. I understand that too. But fell asleep, fell out of the third-story window, and the breath was knocked out of him, and he was not breathing, and they thought he was dead. And Paul went over and he revived this boy, brought him back to life, brought life back into him. Somehow, we don't know exactly how it was. But the purpose of that, when you read the book of Acts, you notice that everything Peter did, the book of Acts, Luke makes sure that he tells you about those same type of things that Paul does to prove that Paul was the apostle, the 12th apostle, out of season. He wasn't one of the original ones, but he's the one that took Judas's place. And it becomes clear that Luke is carefully confirming that Paul was selected for that purpose. And Paul had the same powers that the Lord gave to the original 12, with the authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. And so that's the end of the resurrection stories. There are no more in the Bible. There are no more. That's it. That's all of them. Reviving a person to live again, to die a second death later on here on earth. Live again in their human bodies. But they were all attached to, get this, Elijah, Elisha, who had the miracle working powers of the Lord, Jesus, who was the Lord with his miracle working powers, and Peter and Paul, who were designated and given that authority from the Lord. How many people in the Bible, Old and New Testament, actually saw a glimpse into heaven through a vision or a dream of some sort, and lived to tell us about it? Those who did not die but saw heaven. Well, the first one, of course, was Moses. Moses is on the Mount Sinai. The Lord says, I want you to build a tabernacle complex. By the way, the tabernacle complex is already here in heaven, the real one, so I'm going to show it to you. You can walk around, you can measure it, you can draw pictures of it, because I want you to copy it down in the camp. So Moses got to see into heaven. Then there was Micaiah, who was a prophet in the northern kingdom. And this is the story with Jehoshaphat and Ahab in 1 Kings chapter 22. And Ahab's going to die. And Ahab doesn't, and Jehoshaphat said, let's get to the prophet Micaiah and get him to tell us what's going to happen in this fight. And Ahab says, I don't want to do this. Micaiah always speaks bad about me. And so they bring in Micaiah, and Micaiah says to them, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by him on his right and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab to go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And the passage goes on to tell us about how that spins out in 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 19 through 21. Micaiah saw heaven, the angels and everything, in a vision, in a dream. He didn't die to have to see that in heaven, just like Moses didn't have to die to see into heaven. Then there's Isaiah. Oh, my soul, Isaiah. In chapter 6, verse 1 through 4, the prophet has a vision. He tells us it's a vision. And he was allowed to see into heaven. It says, in the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on the throne, lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. Seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he covered his feet. And with 2 he flew. And goes on to talk about hearing them sing, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. That's in Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah did not die to have the privilege of seeing into heaven. Neither did he have to leave this earth. It was in a vision. Then there's Ezekiel, twice in Ezekiel, chapters 1 and chapters 10. Ezekiel's a prophet. He's been taken out several years after Daniel was taken out of the southern kingdom. He's on the Chabar River. He's the prophet there. He's living in his tent. He's got the elders of the northern and the southern kingdoms who are all there working on a work project to build a channel, but so that as they're coming down the Tigris River, they can take that channel and go over to the Euphrates River, or the Euphrates and go over the Tigris without having to go all the way down or all the way coming up, or carry the stuff by hand. And sitting in that tent, Ezekiel sees the same thing about the Lord and about all of of what he's doing. He says here in Ezekiel chapter 1:1, now it came about in the 13th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, that I was by the river Chebar among the exiles, and the heavens were open, and I saw visions of God. And it goes on to explain what those visions were. Same thing happens over in Ezekiel chapter 10. Then that jumps to the New Testament. So we've got Moses has seen heaven, Isaiah has seen heaven, Micaiah has seen heaven, Isaiah has seen heaven, and now we come to Paul. Paul says this, it's very interesting. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12:2, Paul says, I know a man who 14 years ago was in a vision, was caught up into the third heaven. Now, in the rabbi's time, in that time there, was at that time, the third heaven is the holy city, the New Jerusalem. He's caught up into the third heaven is what that means. And so he's got a vision. Now Paul's not telling us that this is him, but we pretty much think that this is him. Now, I'm not sure, and I'm not going to say it was him, but he knows a man who's caught up into this third heaven. He didn't die to go see heaven. He didn't die and then come back to tell Paul. He did it in a vision. And of course, then there is also John, the Revelator. John, the Revelator. John wrote the Revelation while he was in exile on the Isle of Patmos in a cave, and he had visions. And in his vision, he saw a door open to heaven, and a voice says, come up, and I will show you these things. And it goes on through the book of Revelation where we see that John is looking and explaining things that he is seeing in heaven, and then he looks down to earth and he explains to tell us what's going down on earth, and he looks back up to see what is going on in heaven, and then he looks back down to earth to tell us what's going on to earth. He looks back up to what's going in heaven, from heaven to earth to heaven, heaven to earth, back up to heaven. And he's doing it in a vision. He never died. He did not leave the ground, but he spent time in his mind, in his spirit, in heaven, just like Isaiah did, and Moses did, and Ezekiel did. So, here we have it. Prior to the resurrection of Jesus, Elijah, Elisha, and Jesus had the authority to revive people from the dead. After the resurrection, Peter and Paul had the authority to resurrect people to dead so they could live on. So 5 people were revived from the dead to live on. Now, after the completion of the Bible, that's what we have in the Bible, folks. That's it. That's all we've got. And no place in the Bible does it ever prophesy that we will have the authority to have resurrections from the dead to live again, with the exception of the 2 miraculous prophets who will be in that first part of the tribulation, where they will prophesy and not be able to be killed for 3.5 years. And after 3.5 years, their powers will go away. They will be killed. They'll lay in the streets for 4 days. At the end of the 4 days, they will be resurrected and they will be seen going up to heaven. But they don't continue to live here on earth. They're resurrected. They get up, they go on, okay? That's all we know. And that's going to happen in the future, by the way, too. But does the Bible prophesy future deaths and resurrections to continue to live here on earth? The answer is no, absolutely not. Those who are already in heaven will one day return with the Lord at the Battle of Armageddon, but they're going to be returning in spiritual bodies, not in human bodies. So this is where it comes to us. The Bible doesn't tell us that there will be a crossing back and forth between heaven and earth. And neither does God send people back to earth to watch over or to to watch over one of our loved ones or to give a message to us. The Bible doesn't tell us about that. Even in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, the Lord does not tell us that either returned to live on earth. He told the one over in torment, listen, even if you've got these brothers up there, even if I sent Moses and the prophets, they still wouldn't believe. And so there was no one that was sent back up according from the bosom of Abraham and from the place of torment, according to the Lord. So, this information is what the Bible teaches about a person dying, going to heaven, spending time, and then coming back to live on earth. So that person can die as a human again. Okay, so it doesn't give us any insight into the question today. Now here's coming up to my conclusion on this. And I have reasons for this I'm about to tell you. I had a lesson, the second lesson in my answer series was the question, has God ever spoken to you and how? And in that lesson, I explained the 6 ways that the Lord spoke to me regularly, I mean regularly, in my last long-term ministry office, which was helping people. And one of those 6 ways was in visions and dreams. Visions and dreams. And in that explanation, I gave examples in that lesson where a project would be put on me. The pastor would call and say, okay, the flood, Allison, has happened. This is your project. Lead it to help the people. This is Ike. This is Katrina, blah, blah, blah. It goes on. Okay, so. And none of them did the Lord want me to help them in the same way. So there wasn't a set a plan to help them, these people, because it was some things were different about every plan. And I would pray to the Lord and say, Lord, please give me or help me wrap my mind around what you want me to do to help these masses of people. And in an instant, I would daze off in a daydream. These always came in a daydream. Other things came at night in a vision at night. But these were daydreams, day visions. And I would see the whole project, and I'd even see the people who I needed, and I'd write out the job descriptions and all this kind of stuff after I'd had the vision or the daydream, and we would work the plan, and it worked perfectly, and the people would walk through the door, and I'm thinking, oh my soul, that's who I knew was going to do this job, and I needed this person here, I needed this person here, and they would walk through the door. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people would walk through the door. So I believe in having visions and having dreams, because God speaks to me in visions and dreams. But I also tell you, He also does not speak to me in vision and dreams. And what I mean by that is, when I asked the Lord to wrap my mind around how to organize something and nothing occurred, nothing happened, there were no visions and there were no dreams, I knew that I needed to go back and say, Pastor, the Lord has not told me how to do this. I don't think this is the job for me. Someone else, the Lord has someone else to bless with the way to do this. And it was fortunate my pastor understood that very much, because that's the way he operated too. When the Lord acts and He answers your question, like He answered Gideon in the fleece, when He answers your question, the answer is yes. And when He does nothing, the answer is no, absolutely no. Well, with that in mind, here's where I want to jump off, and I want to tell you this. These people that believe that they had died and had gone to heaven experienced something. And in that, I want you to understand this. This is their testimony. This is what went through their mind. This is what God said to them. This is what God spoke to them in a vision, just like with Moses and Micaiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel and Paul and John. No doubt, they fully believe that they died because they were told that they were dead. They were told that. And that's how they know that they died. And during that time of what was ever going on with their body, whatever was going on with their body, they had a vision from the Lord. And I'm telling you, they're not lying about this vision. They are describing their experience when something was going on with their body. Remember, medical experts today tell us that after breath and heartbeat stop, that does not immediately cause death to occur because of the brain waves still firing. Medical experts tell us that the death of the body and the brain depends on many factors, on the current temperature, on the moisture in the body, on the amount of oxygen compared to carbon dioxide in the blood, and some other variables. And with all these stories, there are just too many unanswered questions as to what was actually happening to the body when the people said, this person is dead. But those people were revived later on, be it forever how long. And we've heard the story about the child who fell into the water for more than 15 minutes and was pulled out with no brain damage or anything because it was icy cold water. So we know these stories. We know them. Yes, we hear them. It all has to do with the surroundings and the variables. You have to remember, it has not been long since we have been able to accurately pronounce death quickly. But we did it anyway. That person's dead, that person's dead, that person's dead. We cover them up with a sheet. That person's dead, they've died, we cover them with a sheet, and we walk on. And they may have be dead, and they may not be dead, depending on the circumstances. Was it cold outside? The person in shock? Was the breath so low that you couldn't see it and you couldn't feel the heartbeat because it wasn't there? If it's very common among EMS people that they go and they catch elderly people who they're not breathing and the heartbeat's not there, but they say that heartbeat and that beat will come back soon because of them stressing and trying to do something that overshakes them. They've got a word for it. I believe, personally, that those who have gone to heaven are simply telling us of their experience. And let me end with this story. I believe in visions of looking into heaven. I do that. March 10th of 1967, my father died. I was actually saved on the 9th, the night before, in a revival service. And Dad, on Thursday morning, had come into my room about 7 o'clock, and he didn't think he woke me up, but I was awake, and he prayed over me. And then he went to an 8 o'clock doctor's appointment. They put him in the hospital immediately, and Saturday evening he died about 7 o'clock, and I never saw him again after he prayed over me. When we got home from the hospital, and I finally got laid down in bed after everybody had left the house, because we had people there till late that night. And as I was shut my eyes, I went to sleep, and I had a vision, a short vision, where I saw my Father in heaven, and I knew it was Him. And He turned to me and He said, "All will be well. All will be well, son." And then it closed and went away. I believe that I have seen into heaven also. I was focused on Dad, so I didn't really catch what was happening all around. But for just that long, I heard the words, "All will be well. All will be well, son."